Hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in, or clicking or tapping on my video rather, whichever it is. Today we're going to be going over how to fix a common 7.3 Powerstroke Diesel oil leak when it's cold outside. And generally this is caused by a leaking oil cooler, or oil cooler seals rather. I'm going to go over with you in this video how to reseal the oil cooler properly to make sure it doesn't leak anymore. As you can see in this video clip here, the 7.3 Powerstroke Diesel on my excursion has been leaking pretty significantly whenever it's cold outside, and it's gotten worse to the point where it would even start leaking when it's only 20 degrees. And don't let the job scare you, it's really not that bad. So follow along and let's get this done.
Yeah, I'm sure my neighbors love waking up to this thing warming up. So now that we've got the truck warmed up a little bit, let's go pull it in the garage and I'll show you how to reseal a 7.3 oil cooler. Now I've got the vehicle in the garage and you're probably wondering why I don't just use the lift there to pick it up. And that's because this lift won't pick up this vehicle for a couple reasons. Number one, because of the way the frame is on this truck, it's a little bit difficult to grab it with the lift and not hit the drive shaft. And number two, it's just simply too heavy. The lift is only rated for 7,000 pounds and the truck gets a little shaky on it, so I feel much more comfortable rolling up on these ramps here. To make this job a lot easier, drive the truck up on some ramps. That way you have a lot more room underneath when crawling around underneath the truck. It already sits up high as is, but having another 6 inches or so of clearance underneath the truck really makes a big difference when you go to do this job. Alright, first things first, you're going to want to start by draining the coolant. Using the 19mm wrench, loosen the drain valve on the radiator a little bit. Eventually, you'll be able to turn it by hand. And my advice is don't back it out all the way. Loosen it to the point where the coolant starts flowing, like so. Then take a piece of rubber hose and run it into a container to store your coolant. If you're going to reuse your coolant, make sure you keep it clean. Keep dirt and debris out of it, but in this case I'm going to be adding new coolant to the vehicle. It's due for a coolant change, so I'm not too concerned about that, but at least this helps keep the coolant in the container and off the floor. Helps keep things a lot cleaner. Now you're probably going to notice that it's not going to drain fast at all, so how do you fix that? Let some air in by taking the cap off the top. That will let air replace the coolant that is now being drained into the container, as you see here.
Now is also a good time to do an oil change on your vehicle. I'm going to go ahead and drain the oil out of the oil pan and remove the oil filter while the coolant's draining the rest of the way. And the reason why it's a good idea to do an oil change on your vehicle while you're doing this job is you have to take the oil filter out anyway, and you're going to lose some oil. My advice is just do this job when you're due for an oil change, then you can drain all the oil out of the pan and out of the filter, and it really helps to make less of a mess of this already significantly messy job. And for those of you who aren't already familiar with this trick, punching a hole in the bottom of the filter and letting it drain makes it much cleaner taking the oil filter off. As you can see here, because I've drained all the oil out of the filter, there's no oil spilling down the side as I take the old filter off. After you've removed the oil filter, use a 1/4 inch extension and ratchet to remove the coolant plug next to the oil cooler where the oil filter mounts. Loosen the plug to the point where you can turn it by hand. Then grab a drain pan and take the drain plug out the rest of the way. Make sure you have the drain pan ready to catch the remaining coolant which will flow out of the drain plug port. Once the draining coolant has flowed to a drip, clean the coolant plug off with a wire brush and make sure to use some thread lock before reinstalling the plug. This will help ensure a tight seal and keep the plug from backing out. Then using a small flathead screwdriver, remove the clip and the electrical plug for the engine block heater. Now there are 3 bolts you'll need to remove to loosen the backside of the oil cooler, and it's very important you use an impact socket initially to loosen these bolts. And the reason for using an impact socket on these bolts is it's much stronger than a chrome socket, especially a deep well socket. The problem is these bolts are probably seized, and it's going to take a lot of torque to break them loose. If you don't have a strong socket, it could round off the head of the bolt, and then you have to use an extractor to back the bolts out. I've found it's much more helpful to use an impact socket initially when loosening these bolts, and I've never had a problem. Now we're back on top of the engine, and you'll see I've got the thermostat out along with the upper radiator hose. I'm putting a new thermostat in because the old one was sticking open and the engine wasn't warming up fully, so that's why I have this off. You don't have to take the thermostat out, but it does really help if you get the radiator hose out of the way. You'll see here I've got a wrench on one of the bolts that we're going to need to loosen to take the front part of the oil cooler loose from the engine. It's a little bit of a trick, and it may help to take that elbow off of the water pump as well here. Sometimes that can get in your way, and if you take that off, it makes it a lot easier. But in this case, I was able to sneak a ratchet wrench in there, so it's 1 less seal I have to buy and 2 fewer bolts I have to take out. Now again, have your drain pan ready, because as soon as you loosen this bottom bolt on the front part of the oil cooler, more coolant is going to drain out. Now we're back underneath the truck and the oil cooler is finally loose. Sometimes you may have to pry the oil cooler off the side of the engine block. Other times it'll fall off on its own. In this case it fell off on its own, so I was able to sneak it right out of there and had no issues getting it off whatsoever. Be very careful when taking this off. You don't want to drop it, and have some paper towels or some shop rags ready. It's going to drip a lot of oil and coolant out of there. It's just overall really messy and nasty. So make sure you have plenty of rags available to clean up. Sometimes the old gaskets stick on the engine block or the oil cooler. Make sure you remove the old gaskets. You definitely don't want to double gasket these. And here is the oil cooler. I've got it on a drain pan to catch any other oil or coolant that might come out of it while I'm taking it apart. And what I'm doing here is I'm just putting a little arrow on the cooler assembly so I know which side goes towards the oil filter. This way I make sure I put it back together the same way it was before I took it off the truck. Now you'll notice on the oil cooler there's a little tab here that you can use a screwdriver or a pry bar to pry the oil cooler housing out of the 2 brackets. And this comes in really handy when separating it. It's usually pretty easy. This one came apart fairly easy. Some I've heard can be a little bit of a pain, but as you can see in this one here, it popped out just fine. I didn't have any trouble with it. Now that we've gotten it apart, you can see how the oil cooler works. The middle piece is a cooler. And these ends here have coolant flowing from one end to the other, but they also have oil flowing through it. So the way they keep it separated is the coolant flows through the little holes in the middle that you can see on either end, and then the oil flows through the side of the oil cooler. There's 2 holes on either side. They're big holes, and you can see what looks to be like a little radiator piece inside there. And that's where the oil flows around. The coolant flows through the middle of it, and the oil flows around the outside. And that helps keep the engine oil cool. Now that we've got the oil cooler apart, make sure you check all the pieces and remove the old seals. Sometimes they stay behind on the end pieces, other times they'll stay on the oil cooler. And as you can see on these rubber seals, there's cracks and they're deteriorating. In this case, this one broke completely in half while I was taking it off. And that's why the oil's leaking. The seal dries up, gets hard and brittle, and then eventually it can no longer seal oil. And in colder temperatures, when the rubber contracts, the oil is no longer sealed and leaks out of the oil cooler during cold starts, and doesn't leak once the engine warms up. Now's the fun part. We get to take brake clean or favorite cleaner of your choice and clean all the parts. Use your favorite toothbrush and make sure that you get these parts nice and shiny clean. It's not really that important that you get the outside of them clean, but I just like working with clean stuff once I put it back together. Now it's time to put all your new seals on. Make sure that the big seals go in the middle and the smaller seals go on the outside. They're identical seals, 2 on each side of the oil cooler. As you can see, the outer ones are a little bit smaller diameter than the inner ones. Make sure these are put in the right place and sealed on tight. Now I like to take a little bit of grease and put them on these O-rings. That way they slide into the outside pieces of the oil cooler easily. You don't have to worry about tearing the seals. One of the biggest concerns I have when putting this back together is if you don't lubricate these pieces well enough, they can actually tear the rubber seals when you press them back together. This is just transmission fluid. It helps it go together easily. Now what I'm using here is I'm using a press to press the pieces of the oil cooler back together. It's a little bit of overkill. Don't press it too hard, especially if there's something not lining up right. And you want to take a razor blade, clean the surfaces where the oil cooler is going to mount back onto the engine, then carefully reinstall the oil cooler. Again, it's probably going to leak a little bit. There's going to be a little bit of oil and coolant left in there, so just have your drain pan ready. But for the most part, it should slide in pretty easily. Take a few bolts to help start your seals, install the new seals on the ends of the oil cooler, and then you can actually start these by hand to help hold the seals in place once you line it up with the engine. Leave the back oil cooler bolts loose when you start with those, because you're still going to have to install the front seal, as you can see here, and then put those 2 bolts in place. I like to leave a little bit of a gap so I can slide the seal in, then start the bolts by hand. That way I know everything's lined up and I don't have to worry about any leaks. Once everything's lined up properly, go back and tighten up the bolts with your ratcheting wrench. Don't get them too tight. Remember, you can always go back and retighten. If you over-tighten and break something, you're in a whole new world of problems. And make sure it's good and snug. Snug it up with your 3/8" ratchet. Again, not too tight, but enough to keep everything snug. Plug the engine block heater back in. Make sure to secure the little clip. Then use a new crush washer. Reinstall the engine oil drain plug if you drained all the engine oil out of the engine while doing this job. In this case, this is what I did. And then tighten it up with the 19mm wrench. I like to fill this style of oil filter up because it holds so much oil. It reduces dry start time, and it's one of these oil filters that you can install without having to turn upside down and dump all the oil out. So I like to fill this oil filter up before starting the engine. Then slide the used coolant reservoir out from underneath the truck. Take the little rubber hose off if you used it. Now that oil in the container there was there before it, so don't worry, it's not leaking oil in the coolant. Then tighten the drain plug back up on the little radiator and use a 19mm wrench. Barely snug it. No need to get it very tight at all. Then fill the coolant reservoir up with coolant. Alright, I filled the engine up with oil, made sure all the fluid levels look good. All that's left to do now is start the truck up, let it run for a little bit, let it warm up. We'll check for leaks, make sure there's nothing leaking, make sure the oil is staying out of the coolant, and vice versa. So let's see how it goes.
It's a little bit cold in the garage today.
So after letting the truck run for a while, everything's looking good. Coolant level's still fine, engine oil level is good, oil pressure is good. Took a look underneath the truck and couldn't find any leaks, so we should be good to go. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Give it a thumbs up if you did, and I'll see you next time.